We'll just go ahead and get rolling here. Welcome to our Flora Seraphim and YWCA collaboration. We felt like it was very important that we pull together a discussion like this one. And the focus of today's discussion is going to be about racism and empowering women. And YWCA just felt like the perfect partner to have this discussion with, since YWCA's mission is to empower women and to eliminate racism. So we're so thrilled to be working with the ladies at YWCA. Thank you so much for jumping in with Flora Seraphim to create this opportunity and helping us round out such a powerful group of panelists. So Francesca Rattray is going to be our moderator today. So I'm going to let her take over from here and ask our questions, and hopefully we have a very productive discussion.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Hannah, and thanks to partnering with Flora Seraphim. If you're not familiar with Flora Seraphim, visit their website. They exist to provide opportunities for women to flourish. And Hannah has been a super fan of YWCA for the past year. She's worked with United Way's Emerging Leaders Council, and she reached out, wanted to know how we can work together. And it was happening right about 8 weeks ago when everything was happening around the tragedy of George Floyd, and we thought this would be a great opportunity. I also want to give a little shout out to my staff for their inspiration and their ideas. Prashama Daly and Kim Berry, thank you so much for helping to put this together. So as Hannah was saying, YWCA exists to eliminate racism and empower women. And the twin pandemics of COVID and racism over the past several months have encouraged the YWCA network to have conversations, come together and have conversations about what is our work going to look like going forward. This is what we hope to be the start of several conversations that we would like to be involved with, hopefully with Flora Seraphim, to educate the community about racial justice and gender equity. So by way of introduction, we're going to jump right in with our first question and allow each panelist to answer the question and tell a little bit about themselves. So this is for all of our panelists, and let's start with Dorinda. What is your definition of woman of color? Why do you consider yourself a woman of color? And what's been your story about being a woman of color?
It helps when you're not on mute. Did you want me to introduce myself as well, did you say? Yes. So I'm Dorinda Roll. I work in the area of leadership development, diversity, equity, and inclusion, workshops and advising. I'm also the author of the new book, Martyrs for the Movement, Black Bodies, Civil Rights, and Black Lives Matters, and very active in my community. So to your question, if my brain can remember all three of them, people would define me as a woman of color, and I think that's just a broad term that a lot of women could fall into if they would be considered to be non-Caucasian or non-white or mixed with any combination of what we would consider to be an ethnic group. I define myself as an African-American woman. I'm not offended if someone calls me a Black woman. I think that the term woman of color is a broad definition, and I prefer a narrower definition. But I'm not offended if somebody categorizes me that way. It's okay. What was your second question?
No, that is it. Telling your story as you define what a woman of color is. So yeah. Thank you. I'm going to pass it on now to Teresa, and your definition of woman of color, and what is your story related to being a woman of color?
So I self-identify, always have, as Mexican American. Under that umbrella, women of color, I wouldn't mind also being identified as that. Similar to what Dorinda said, is a woman of color to me anyway is a woman who is a non-Caucasian woman. In terms of a little background about myself. I'm from San Antonio. I was born and raised on the west side of San Antonio. I am a social worker, and so the social worker values very much aligned with my own philosophy in life, and eliminating racism and advocacy for the marginalized have always been a core value for me. And I'm a first generation college graduate, and I just received my doctorate this past spring. So that was very important in terms of my identity as a Mexican American. So that's all about me.
So great. And as our conversation goes on, you have pointed out that many in the Mexican American community do not identify as women of color. So that's something to explore as we go along with the rest of our questions. But congratulations on your PhD. And moving on to Amori, tell us a little bit about you, your background, what it means to be a woman of color, and how does that align with your story?
I'm very glad to be here. My name is Amori Sarasa Olujimi. I am African American, but I was raised a little differently than many African Americans. When I was 6, my family legally changed our last name to a Nigerian last name. And that was in an attempt to understand more about our roots and to try to give me and brother more strength, more value in who we were as Black or African American people. My background also includes being a queer woman and a transgender woman. So I have been able to claim my true life for the last 9 years. I actually started transition in college, went to Trinity University, art major, sociology minor. What I think a woman of color is, as the other panelists, Dorinda and Theresa, have said so far, is a woman who is not of mostly Caucasian descent, usually a woman who could be Black or brown. That could include African descendant people, Latinos, Asian descendant people. I'm not so sure about some other categories. I've learned that women of color and whiteness kind of clash. So there are people who I would think are brown skinned who may be classified as white. And within my community, I do a lot of work when it comes to helping transgender people like myself, but I'm really trying to reach out more to LGBTQ people as a whole who are Black and of color, particularly Black. There's not many of us here. And I was raised in San Antonio, born in Arkansas.
Great, thank you so much. And you bring up a great point about definitions and who created those definitions. And we'll get into that in a moment. So now I'd like to turn it over to Francesca Guidry Jackson. Tell us your story on how you identify as a woman of color and what your background is.
Hi, I'm also excited to be here. And just like Teresa, I'm also a social worker. Currently, I'm serving as a director of child development at the YWCA. So my definition of, what it means to be a woman of color. In my family, I'm Black and Asian. I'm Black and Filipino. So I kind of was born into, the racism piece. So with that being said, I think that being a woman of color when I thought about it kind of more on the meaningful side, like what is my experience as being a woman of color, and thinking through that. I think that it's a place where we not only survive but thrive through systems of oppression, and so I think that role encourages. I'm able to advocate and empower change through those systems.
Great, and that's a perfect segue into our next question about defining racism. So in the last 8 weeks, the conversation of racism has been top of mind, first and foremost. Many people have read Robin DiAngelo's White Privilege, and she discusses this notion of the good-bad binary of racism, which is many of us look to the KKK and say that is racism. I'm not that, therefore I'm not racist. And she said that the conversation goes beyond that. So what is racism, and what are examples of racist language and racist behavior that we may not realize are racist? Let's start with Teresa this time. You okay. I think you are muted at the moment. There we go. No?
Okay, I'm sorry. Could you rephrase that question for me once more? I apologize.
Just defining racism and examples of racist behavior that maybe we don't realize are racist.
One thing I think that's important in terms of racism is kind of to make the distinction between discrimination, because racism ultimately is about power and privilege and white supremacy. And it disadvantages an ethnic group in relation to a white majority. That's the way I see it and understand it.
Okay.
And my experience, or racist acts that we may not see overtly, or I think the first thing is that's essential to be able to recognize that is to notice our own kind of implicit bias in terms of racism, because if that's hidden, then we'll never, or I'll never see a racist act for what it really is. And I think about conversations people have and using couched language. Thinking back to people I've been around in social settings, and that's always kind of an awkward situation because oftentimes, not as much as in the past, but I'm the only minority there. And so people have made comments about maybe their work situation and someone being a privileged class, so you're not able to fire them. And typically 90% of that time, the privileged class was a person of color.
I see.
And so everyone just kind of goes along with that conversation. And that's one example of an implicit racism.
Okay. And how about you, Dorinda, in defining racism? You had mentioned power in our earlier conversations too.
Yeah, I usually define racism in terms of a power structure, like Teresa said, but there are lots of different types of racism and how it shows up. There's cultural racism. We kind of touched on that. And I hate to go back to a conversation that we had when others who are on the webinar right now were not a part of, but there can be what appears to be racism within a particular culture, but really it's about discrimination or prejudice that you might have against people within your own ethnic group. Also, there's environmental racism, there's individual racism, there's institutional racism, which I think a lot of people may be familiar with, or if something happened, you could identify within an organization or an institution and say, oh, that's racism. And I think the thing about racism is that it's difficult to define, but you know it when you see it. You know it when you feel it. So some would argue that Black people cannot be racist because we're not of the power structure. There's not anything that I could do to you, Francesca, where I have more power over you as a white woman. My word would mean nothing. And I think we've seen several examples of a woman in the park, a man in the park in New York, in Central Park, bird watching of all things. White woman's there, she's letting her dog run amok where they're not supposed to be off of the leash. She gets offended that this person, a Black male, has dared say something to her. So she's in the wrong, but she feels, and of course, I'm sure we'll get into white privilege at some point, but most people may know what that is. But she felt perfectly fine pulling out her phone, knowing she was being videoed and calling the police and saying exactly what she told him what she was going to say, and proceeded to do that. That's clear racism mixed in with white privilege, in that I'm offended by you, a Black man, so I will use my power and my voice to harm you. And she would have had the forces of the New York City police coming down on him. But of course, he had already left the park by the time they got there. But those kinds of things happen. And so when we see it, we know it. We don't exactly know the word for it. But I can tell you, as a Black woman, I know that had I called the police to say, I'm in the park and this man is making me feel threatened, they would have probably said to me, then get your tail in the car and leave.
It's sad to think that that might have happened, but you are most likely correct. So moving on to Francesca, what, they say racism is a social construct. What is your definition of racism?
I'd say everything that the ladies just mentioned. So the power, the distribution of power, the power and privilege. I'd add injustice to that definition. And in my instance, I guess I would add that it's beyond just the Black and white, right? So I have the Asian perspective. And many times when we talk about racism, we're talking about directly the Black and white experience, because that's kind of what the country, early on, that's what we've dealt with. But in my instance, I would add that it's more than just Black and white to what the ladies had already mentioned.
Okay, thank you. And Amori, what about you? How have you experienced racism? What is your definition of racism?
I definitely agree that racism is about having true systemic power over other people. I would say that it's possible for a Black person, Asian person, or other people who are not white to be prejudiced, but that missing part is the power dynamic, the ability to actually be part of a class where a system was designed to benefit prevents those people from being able to be racist. I'm not saying that other people cannot be mean or destructive to a person who could be white, but there is still a difference between racism versus prejudice. I have experienced racism maybe in a compounded way because of also being transgender, except I would say it was more noticeable towards the beginning of my transition when I didn't blend in as well, because I would go through people not being sure if I was a Black man or a Black woman, and that ambivalence could make some people uncomfortable. But I would say that nowadays, I have it pretty easy. My experience in everyday life is completely different than my brother's. I have never had the cops called on me for jaywalking. I have never had the cops, I've never had a ticket yet. I'm 30. I don't get pulled over like he does, but my brother can go through the same situations and get harassed much more than me. I'm not treated like a threat. But if I didn't look the way that I do, if I was not the woman that I am, if I didn't come across the way that I do know my experience would be different. I have also, just that one more thing, I did, when I started transitioning, go to the San Antonio Central Library, and I happened to be in the young adult fiction section, just looking for some books. And this was towards the beginning of my transition, about 9-10 years ago. And there was a woman there, a white woman, and she was very offended by me being there. I had eyeshadow, I did not have breasts, I was not feminized yet. She treated me as if I were some type of creep, and she literally told me, get out, get out. And I knew that I could have ignored her, but then knowing the power that she has working there and that she can invent a situation, I chose to just leave and stop trying to tell her I came here when I was younger. I would check out books. I'm just here for books. And I left. So there have been awkward moments like that, but it's gotten better because I now am treated as the woman that I am. But I also still am very hyper aware. I do still have people lock doors sometimes. I do have people who are scared of me. I am almost 6 feet tall. I'm pretty tall. And I do think people are scared of Black women as well. So when I'm in public, I find myself avoiding the gaze of strangers who I don't know. I act like I don't see them. If I see someone clutch their purse close to their body, I pretend I don't see it. I just try to ignore a lot of things.
No. I'm glad we're getting into these tough conversations and talking about how you personally have experienced this. I want to turn it specifically to Teresa right now. Teresa, you have studied this particular question. We mentioned colorism or this stratification just based on the levels of darkness of one's skin, racism within groups and between groups that consider themselves groups of color. What is the reason for this, and what do you believe is what types of biased behavior like this have you experienced? You mentioned this earlier as you introduced yourself. Can you say more on this particular type of racism?
So early on, as a little girl, one of my earliest memories was in the summertime, and my mom telling me that if it was really sunny outside, I couldn't play outside because I was already dark enough. So my nickname was Little Pretita, meaning little dark girl. And so I grew up with that constantly. And the idea of that shame that one carries with them, for me, was intensified. As I mentioned, I was born on the west side of San Antonio, but around age 11, entering those critical development ages, I moved to the north side, which was predominantly Caucasian. And I do what we naturally do, kind of gravitated towards the other kids that look like me. And that was the first time that I encountered other Mexican American children or individuals who talked negatively about their race and wanted to identify with the white minority, the majority. And that intensified my conflict and the shame. And so I think I have shared this before, that it wasn't until way early into my adult life that I really embraced that part of me, that my culture. And part of it I attribute to the family I grew up in, always hearing our story and our history and experiencing the discrimination and racism firsthand. And then the stories my father would share, he was asked to leave a restaurant in downtown San Antonio once they realized that he was speaking Spanish. They didn't know he was Mexican because he was so light skinned. Apparently I didn't inherit that gene, but he was asked, as soon as he started speaking Spanish, asked to leave the restaurant. He could pick up his food in the alleyway. And so I grew up around that. And so that I think helped to appreciate as I got older, as I developed into who I was going to be, have pride associated with my ethnicity. And another thing I attribute to my parents is I didn't grow up with this intergroup kind of racism that I see the seeds of it in our own Hispanic or Mexican culture, especially now in terms of Mexicans or Latinos against Black people. The whole issue of Black Lives Matter right now is so critical. And we need to pay attention to that. And in the background, there are people that say, well, brown lives matter too, our lives. Well, it's not a contest. Yes, I'm very passionate about what's happening to the Mexican immigrants and how they're being demonized. I mean, that is huge to me. But right now, that doesn't diminish the Black Lives Matter movement. And I had a debate with a colleague of mine who is of Latino descent, and we were talking about Black Lives Matter, and we both have sons. And I was trying to we were having a debate because she was saying, well, I'm fearful for my son when he goes outside. Mm-hmm. And because we were talking about what has happened to a lot of young African-American boys and men at the hands of unjust police officers. And so she was trying to argue, well, we as women of color and as Latinas, our sons you know, I worry about them as well. I said, yes, I worry about them, but I have never had to have the conversation that almost I believe every Black woman mother has had to have with her children. I've never had to have that.
And I think it is different, Teresa. Thank you for, standing up in a space that probably was a bit uncomfortable for you, because Black and brown men are killed, it seems, at a higher rate when they're unarmed by the police than another group. But I think the difference here is, what I always look at is, as a social scientist, where's the data? What does the data tell me? So if you can say that Black men and brown men are killed by police when they're unarmed at an equal rate or an equal number, that's one thing. But Black Lives Matters is about more than just being killed unarmed by the police. We have other instances where we consider that Black men, well, let me correct that, as someone did to me recently. Not just Black men, but Black women. When you can have Breonna Taylor asleep in her own apartment and she's murdered, and no one is held accountable for that. You can have, and his name escapes me, the young man in Dallas who was a CPA in his own apartment. Policewoman claims she got mixed up, was on the wrong floor, went in his apartment and killed him. So it's like, this makes no sense. So you come to your door and you automatically kick the door in and start blazing and shooting? Or if I came home and looked like somebody was in my place, I back out and I call 911 or go to the building manager or something. But so I think that there is a difference, because not only do we have people, Black males, being killed for us, it seems literally no reason, and no one is held accountable, but there are other instances. The man that I mentioned bird walking in the park, he could have easily have been added to that number for no reason. He wasn't doing anything at all wrong. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter, it's the totality of the racism that is perpetuated upon the Black community. I mean, there are other things where I could tell you where Black women are in domestic violence situations. They won't call the police. Why? Because if the police come, then that could mean that they will be kicked out of their apartment or their house, because if they're a renter, then the landlord doesn't want you there because you are a risk, you're a distraction. So now I can't get justice or help or support from people who are sworn to protect and serve me because of the way that they come in. I might even get arrested if that were the case, or the woman who would call the police. So there are other things, whereas if you're a white woman, you never even think about that. They don't have to. They don't suffer the same consequences of simply living your life.
Well, let's stay with women for the moment, for now, and switch gears a bit, talking about being a woman and this this intersectionality between women's empowerment and racial justice and LGBTQ issues, and why we should all be working together. So I want to ultimately end there. So just quickly switching gears and just talking about this, having one foot in different communities, right? As a woman, as a biracial woman, as a transgender woman. I want to turn the question over first to Francesca. You mentioned the challenges of navigating life in two different communities, the Asian community and the Black community. What have you experienced with having one foot in each of those communities, and what thoughts can you share about how do we have a conversation about that?
So for me, let's see, growing up, I guess from the start, just not being fully accepted by the Black community, not being fully accepted by the Asian community. I was a military brat, so we moved all over the world. When we finally moved to San Antonio, it was my first time coming to know the Hispanic culture. And when people look at me, I don't look the part, right? I don't look Black and Asian. People tend to, I get asked all the time, what are you? Where are you from? So I kind of fit into, I guess, the Hispanic look, like what people perceive as someone being Hispanic. And so through that, I think it was really difficult at the age that I moved here. So like developmentally, where I was trying to learn who I was as an individual. And then I was kind of coming to that place, and then we moved to San Antonio. And then it was like I was, you know, thrown into the, like with people ask, you know, thinking that I'm Hispanic, right? So then having to defend, no, I'm Black and Asian. And then, so really not having a place to kind of feel like where I was accepted. So I had a lot of those issues growing up. And like Teresa, it took me into adulthood to actually start coming to my own and accepting who I am just as a culture, you know, and who God made me to look like, right? So with that being said, I think what we can do to continue the fight towards racism is just, I guess, and I posted this on Facebook yesterday, like discuss and not debate, right? So stopping and taking time to hear all of our individual stories. And I think it was mentioned here that everyone has experienced racism at a different level. And so there's truth to that. It's not, you know, when I tell my story, I don't want someone saying, oh, you didn't experience that, or, oh, that's not the truth. Like, that is what I've experienced, and that is my truth, just like everyone on this panel has their truth. And so stopping and just listening, hearing each other's story, and being able to just own our experiences, kind of doing what we're doing today, creating a brave space, a safe space where we can come together and talk about these things, and be willing to listen to each other, so that we can in turn find, you know, what is your experience, what is, you know, each of our experiences, and then somehow coming to a solution, you know, to work together.
Thank you. That's very well said. And related to what you were saying is, you know, it's not enough to just say we're not racist. How can you be anti-racist? That, you know, that's the movement right now, is actively being anti-racist. So Amori, what are your thoughts around that? This is a question for each of the panelists, but let's start with Amori.
That is a great question. I think that to become anti-racist, not only do you have to face head on what racism can look like, understand that it's not necessarily as overt as the example we mentioned earlier. It's not about being a KKK member. It could be as simple as not seeing the benefits that you may get when it comes to making a mistake in life, where it comes to being supported in education. It comes to speaking up for other people around you if you see they're being treated badly, asking them how they feel, but at the same time, respecting if they may or may not want to talk about it with you. It takes a lot of internal work. It takes a lot of reading and learning. And if you come across someone who's willing to answer questions for you, ask them questions, but also understand that people are people and people have limits. Maybe everyone may not always be in a mental space to be the person to answer all these different things for them. So essentially, it takes being able to be self-critical, be open to learning more, reading, and asking questions.
So Dorinda, same question, but there's also a question in the chat that relates to one of the questions we were going to discuss, is how can you be anti-racist, have the tough conversation? What words can we use? You know, how do we, I believe that this conversation is challenging to people because they don't know really, you know, racism vocabulary 101. Mm-hmm. So what are some words we can use, and how do you have this conversation? How do you encourage people who've never had this conversation to have this conversation?
Yeah, and it is a difficult conversation to have, but I think people need to try and distinguish between, are we having a conversation, which is dialogue back and forth? Is it a discussion where, you know, it's kind of like, well, here's my point, then there's your point? Or is it a debate where I just want to win at all costs? And I think for me, when I'm having conversations, and I'll be honest with you, I try to minimize conversations with people who want to be argumentative and not wanting to learn. So, but by the same token, I take it as an opportunity for me to learn why people feel a certain way. If you're going to enter into these conversations, I think you have to arm yourself and be prepared. in terms of vocabulary and knowing the right words to say, that may not help you if there is someone who really wants to be argumentative, they think they're right. Even me with the PhD and having taught African American studies for 7 years at UTSA, I will still get the person who barely made it out of high school will want to debate me and tell me that I'm wrong, although I have lived experience, which is another thing. So I don't really try to win those arguments, but I try to take the standpoint of how can I educate this person? Let me give you some information that you may not know about why Black people feel this way. Why do we feel like Black lives matter? Why do we even have to say it and try to explain to people when they say, well, all lives matter. Mm-hmm. And then you have to be ready with something to come back with. Right. Now, how to be non-racist, that's not a question that I can answer because I don't think that I'm racist. So I can't tell you how not to be racist. Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of people that don't think they are. It almost seems like the worst thing you can say to somebody is, you're racist. And then that really sets them off. Right. I've yet to meet people who say, well, yes, I'm racist and I'm proud of it. No one wants to be racist, although they have just committed what we would consider a racist act. So I don't know, maybe Amore or Teresa might have a better response to that question, but I don't, that's a difficult conversation.
Well, let me put it to Francesca, same question, slightly different twist. How can we have a conversation about racism that doesn't drift into microaggressions? For example, getting asked, where are you from? And you say, I'm from here, from the United States. But no, really, where are you from? So, how do we talk about racism without, and also pointing out that those are microaggressions?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's one thing for people to be interested, but then that's a really good question because I've had this up my whole life, right? So I go in and oftentimes I think it's happened so often that I tend to think, do I tell them up front or do I wait till it happens? But then of course you don't want to start the whole racism conversation up front and just put it out there. And so I've been in situations many, many, many times, job after job, where people don't know that I'm Black and Asian and they're having comments about Black or Asian people, where they're telling me jokes about people with like chinky eyes and those sorts of things, or they're talking about different foods or, just the prejudices that they have. And then a few weeks later, we're together and it comes up that I'm Black or Asian and they're just like, oh my gosh, and then they want to come and apologize or say, oh, I didn't really mean those things. So in my sense, I kind of use it also like Ms. Dorinda, like a learning experience. So sometimes I tend to not say anything and sit back and then wait for them, to figure it out and then not, change like the relationship or the level of like respect or anything that I have for them, but have conversations about that space and that topic.
Thank you. And I'm sure it gets old having that question posed to you over and over and over again. And then finally with Teresa, how can we be anti-racist and draw on your conversation, your comments about being Mexican American, being a member of the Hispanic community here in San Antonio?
So I came across a book by Dr. Abram Kendi, is it, on how to be an anti-racist. And I haven't started it, but I did watch a presentation he gave, and he outlined things on, what's racism. And so you support policies that go after racist structures, systemic racism. You go after that. You acknowledge that there is racism in our society. And for me, it goes back to education. So much has been done to reconstruct our history and the Civil War, and to say it wasn't about enslaving people, that it was about states' rights, but it was about the states' right to enslave people. And so I think all of that is necessary if we're going to actively be anti-racist. And the idea, and I think it's already been spoken about here, it's this racists are bad, they're in the KKK, but there's this whole other, and it was another talk I was listening to, white liberals who have advocated on behalf of different communities of color themselves fall into exhibiting these racist beliefs. And I encourage anyone to do research and read and listen to some of the leading voices. And first of all, we have to let and in terms of African Americans, let them speak. It's their history. They're the experts. And that's kind of all I have.
We have tons of questions in the chat. I want to allow enough time, but the one question that keeps coming up, which coincidence is on our list of questions, what is allyship, and how can all women be allies? How can white women be allies to women of color? And how can women empower each other, white women and women of color? I realize that alone could be a topic for discussion, but let's focus on allyship, and let's start with you, Dorinda, and go around and end the panel portion of this.
Yeah. So first of all, when we talk about an ally, it's usually someone who is committed to, and they make an effort to recognize that they have privilege, right? So that privilege could be based on gender, it could be based on class, it could be based on race or ethnicity, but also sexual identity. And so if you're going to say that you're an ally, I would say pick a fight, okay? Pick a fight or pick a side and say, I'm committed to this, and I will work in solidarity with this oppressed group or this individual in their struggle for justice or in their struggle for their rights. So for me, that means that I feel like as a Black woman, I do have privilege within, or where I could be an ally to people who identify as being in the LGBT community. So there are times I know when I could speak up, because I've been around groups and individuals who will say something about a gay or lesbian person or a transgender person. And so I feel like it's my responsibility to stand up and challenge, why would you say that, or why would you do that? How does that take from you for that person to exist? So in that way, I can be an ally. I don't try to take on everybody. And I think that, you know, if you're a white woman, you can figure out how you could do that.
So I see you nodding, Lori. How about you? What is allyship to you, and how can white women, straight women be an ally to LGBTQ transgender women?
I think allyship requires listening to and learning about experiences that may have similarities to your own and also maybe dissimilar to your own. As Dr. Dorinda mentioned, as a Black woman who is not transgender, some may say that is a cis woman, she can speak up for me even to Black men. There may be Black men who may have issues with LGBTQ people, and they may be more likely to hear her voice. I mean, I say that because my own mother is a woman who's not transgender. Black men come from Black women, and a Black woman's voice may be something they're more likely to listen to if she's not transgender. Now, I'm glad that we're having this conversation about allyship, because allyship does go beyond just white women and what white women could do to help Black or brown women. It can also go with someone like me. What can I do to help women who are not transgender? If I hear people making disgusting jokes about reproductive systems or men being thoughtless or sexist, I can also speak up and remind them, well, we all came from women. Most of us came from women who were cis, And when you make those types of jokes, you're actually making fun of how we got here. We would not be able to be here if it wasn't for the very woman that you're making fun of. So I can also speak up and help stand up for other women who may be more accepted than me as well. I have my own things that I can contribute to help speak up for them too. And I do think white women can also acknowledge that maybe they may be at the front of the line when it comes to if they were attacked, medical care might be better. They could do things as simple as come to doctor's appointments, come to a situation that a friend or someone is going through, and be there to listen. And if the person they're there with is not being listened to, they can speak up and say the exact same thing that person was saying and say, you're not listening though. This is what she's going through. This is what she needs you to understand. Allyship to me is amplifying voices, not trying to step on toes and always lead the way, but knowing that dance of listening and speaking up, but also learning when to take a back seat too.
Lots of thank yous to you for speaking up in the chat over here. Thank you for sharing that. And so Teresa, allyship and how we can be allies to each other, how we can be allies to women of color.
I think it's been touched on that whatever privilege an individual has can be leveraged and used to be an ally to another woman. But always, as I said before, allow that other individual to tell you kind of what they need. Let them lead the way and you accompany them. But there are instances where individuals with privilege or power get listened to. I've seen it several times, and one person can say one thing and another individual that has privilege and power say something, the exact same thing, and it's received and acknowledged and accepted. And those who do enjoy that power and privilege need to accept that and see, okay, not feel guilt about that, but what can I do with this? How can I be an ally to another person?
And so Francesca, last word on allyship and what that means.
So to me, allyship means building trustful relationships with, and offering support when it's needed to just groups of marginalized individuals, and helping them, standing up when they're, with the challenges and issues that they face.
Mm-hmm.
So we could literally go on for another hour. This is just sort of a taste.
Can I share just one quick story? This happened just yesterday. I was out in public with my grandson, and we needed to stop into the restroom. So he was standing outside of the ladies' room waiting for me. As I went in, two women were there, and I was just about to walk all the way back to get into a stall. Another woman came in. I don't know what her ethnicity was, but there were already two women in kind of around the sink area. I don't know if they were washing their hands, but whatever. The woman who came in, the third woman, said, "You're not supposed to be in here." One of the two women looked rather masculine. It didn't bother me because I was going in there, I was going to get in the stall, close the stall, do what I need to do and get out. But this other woman, the way she came in there and said that, it made me back up. And I said, "Oh, we're not going to do that, really?" And she turned around and walked out. So for me, that's one way of being an ally. I don't know if either one of those women were trans or transitioning or what, but I knew what she meant because, as I said, one of the women had a masculine look to her. The woman who said it, I don't know if she were a white woman, but it doesn't matter. When we're talking about being an ally, it doesn't matter if they're being offended by a white person, a black person, or whomever, but they are coming against a marginalized group. And so I feel like that was I didn't even think about it. It was like, I don't know what I would have done had she said, "Oh, what are you going to do about it?" I don't know what would have happened then. Maybe the three of us might have had to,
Well, you bring up You bring up a great segue into the questions from the panel. But first, a big thank you to Dorinda, Teresa, Amori, and Francesca for sharing your time and your experiences and getting us just really scratching the surface of a difficult conversation. I'm looking through the questions in the chat, and it seems that we have sort of a theme developing. One is really about this difficult conversation. How do you have conversations with your white family at, when you go home to see them, who say, aren't we supposed to be colorblind? How do you have conversations about racism in the workplace? What are some, so really, this idea of conversation, it's this discomfort that people feel in talking about this topic. And you can just also look at social media and see that there's cancel culture, smackdown culture, that people really just don't know what to say. So help us out with that. Who would like to start by addressing that question?
I'll say something real quick. No matter how these questions are asked, it's very hard to make any progress if the people who the questions are about are not willing to be self-critical. We can talk all day about how a person could possibly not be racist. If you happen to be someone who's on your own anti-racism journey, you've done the work, or if you happen to have family members who might be white or of some type of class which may have more privilege than you. I mean, it's kind of hard to have a conversation if the party who's being offensive is not ready to actually have it too. Mm-hmm. I will say that.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say as well, Amari, you mentioned something about doing the work and on your own journey. I think that if you care about what's happening now and these opportunities for these discussions, you do have to be introspective and realize that it is a journey. It's not like, okay, I took a course, I read this book, and I am no longer racist, or I have no opportunity to offend anybody. Myself, this could go on, as you said, I see in the chat, people are wanting to know when is part 2 coming on, but even I, with everything I know and have experienced, I microaggressed against someone. And again, when you're talking about microaggressions, it is somewhat about power. And in this particular instance, I said something, did not mean to offend anybody, and that's what microaggression is about. You're not overtly trying to hurt somebody, but I did. And that person let me know in a private way. So I had to respond, and it really made me do some introspection and examine myself and think about, why did you say that? Now it was like, okay, that was stupid. I meant it as a compliment, but it was really stupid that I had done that. So it's like, it's a journey, you're learning. And so that particular mistake, it will never be made again. But I am old enough to know that you learn from your mistakes. That's what's supposed to happen. And so someone, I think in the chat, and then I'm gonna be quiet, they had asked, one of the questions was, like, how do we have these conversations? You can have them, but don't be afraid if you're, a white woman or whoever on this webinar, don't be afraid not to talk because you're afraid of making a mistake. Mistakes will happen. I think most people will recognize when your heart is in a genuine place, when you ask questions out of wanting to learn. People can forgive when you make a mistake if you're doing it from a good place and not wanting to hurt, but you're wanting to learn.
So there is also another question. I want to give this one to Francesca because she has talked eloquently about this. It's about mothers talking to their children. And I'm sure that conversation looks different if you are a Black mother talking to your sons, if you're a white mother talking to your own children. So Francesca, can you talk about how do you talk to your children and teach them about racism? And also in your case, would you be willing to share your story a little bit of how you talk to your own sons?
Yes. So I do have 3 children. I have 2 sons and a daughter. I have an 18-year-old, a 18-year-old son, a 12-year-old daughter, and a 10-year-old son. And I think this is the one Francesca's kind of just talking about. So my 18-year-old, he just graduated from high school. I'm getting ready to send him off to college. And just during this time, with all of the things that are going on currently, it's a scary time, right? As a mother of a Black son, I think I started talking with him, having these talks. I just try to be honest, real, direct, and of course make sure it's age appropriate. So the things that I talked to him about at 10, I can't talk about my son who's 10 right now. We can't have the same conversations because just they're not on the same maturity level as as they were at that age. And so with my oldest son, I did start having these conversations with him when he was about 10 years old. Now that I'm talking about it, it could also be like physical appearance. So my youngest son is a little smaller than my older son, but my older son is 6'4", he's 285 pounds. And when he was 10, he was about to pass me up in height, and I'm like 5'9", so I'm not short. So he was a big kid. And just having those talks about, at home, we know the kind, sweet, loving kid that he is. But when we send him out into the world, they're not going to take time to get to know that part of him. If he's faced in a situation where he's needing to defend himself, or where people view him as a suspect, they're not going to stop and ask 20 questions about what his personal life is like, that he's an athlete, that he's an A student. They're just going to deal with the situation at hand, and I need to make sure that he's equipped to be able to navigate through that situation. And so making sure that he's equipped to do that, I have to talk with him about how the world views him, but also being very mindful of acknowledging that he is a respectful, kind, loving person that he is, and he doesn't have to change that. And so I think as a parent, having those conversations, it has to start at home. Even with my 12-year-old daughter, when she was 5, and I know we're running out of time. When she was 5, she was in summer school. They were going swimming twice a week. She was getting darker each week. It was like this really, really beautiful, like golden brown color. And she came home, and I made the comment to her one day, like, "Oh my gosh, your skin is getting so golden brown. It's beautiful." And she ran off crying, saying, "I don't want to be dark. I want to be white. I want to have white skin." And so my heart just dropped, and I'm thinking, as a parent, how do I teach her to embrace her beauty and her uniqueness? And so for me, it was like going to the library. And so just facts, having conversations, having difficult conversations with them. And I don't think it's ever too early, because it starts with like dolls. You go out and you can barely find dolls that that resemble your children. And so I think for me, it's just starting as soon as you can, within that age appropriateness and their maturity.
So thank you all panelists. The last kind of, we're not going to have time to address this, but there's several questions about defunding the police, which has come out of the protests over the last 8 weeks. I'd love to talk about that at some point, but we really just cannot get there. But in a word, to summarize this evening, I'm glad we got the ball rolling and finally went in this direction and had the first of hopefully many uncomfortable conversations. One word to wrap us up. Teresa.
I'll go with empowering. Yeah, this definitely is a move in that direction.
Amori.
I'll go with vulnerability, revealing.
Thank you. Dorinda.
I think I like empower as well. I think whatever you've learned here on this, with this panel, hopefully it's to empower you to think about what you do a little bit more, think about how you might become a bit more involved. If it's just confronting someone in the restroom like I had to do, or getting more involved with organizations, there's lots of opportunities to be empowered.
And Francesca, looks like you've got a fan following in the chat. After that, what one word to wrap to send us home?
I'd say I have two: diversity and uniqueness.
Awesome. Well, you wonderful women. Thank you so much for this great panel. I look forward to doing it again.